They thought they were playing a prank on the crippled girl, a cruel, twisted joke for the whole town to enjoy. They had no idea they were sending her straight into a conspiracy that was about to burn their entire world to the ground. The people of Cedar Ridge figured they knew Grizzly McGraw. He was a mountain man, a hermit, a ghost who came down from the peaks twice a year for supplies and then vanished. So they cooked up a plan. They'd take Eleanor Whitmore, the paralyzed girl left orphaned and broken after a stagecoach crash, and they'd offer her to the mountain man, a broken woman for a broken man. They couldn't wait to see the disgust on his face when he turned her away. They wanted to watch her spirit finally shatter, but they didn't know Silas McGraw, and they really didn't know Eleanor Whitmore. They saw a crippled girl in a wheelchair. They didn't see the brilliant mind behind her eyes, a mind that had already figured out their town was rotting from the inside out. And they didn't know the mountain man wasn't just hiding from grief, he was guarding a secret so dangerous it had already gotten his father killed. A secret that the most powerful man in Cedar Ridge would do anything to possess. What started as a joke was about to become a war, and the battleground was a tiny cabin, high in the unforgiving peaks of the Rockies. The morning it all began, Silas McGraw was watching the mist curl through the pines. For 15 years, this mountain had been his fortress. At 42, he was more rock and shadow than man, carved into stillness by a war he'd survived, and a peace he'd had to fight even harder for. His hands, a roadmap of scars and calluses, moved with a deadly economy, stoking the fire, sharpening the knife at his belt. It was his father's knife, its steel worn smooth over 3 generations. The townsfolk down in Cedar Ridge called him Grizzly. They whispered he was crazy, a runaway, a man haunted by ghosts. Some of the old-timers remembered the boy who'd left for the war, the boy who'd promised to come back for Margaret Louise Hartwell. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew Margaret hadn't just died of consumption. That was the lie he'd been told, the lie he'd almost believed. His fingers traced the initials carved into the cabin's main beam, SM plus ML. He'd come back from the war to find a fresh grave and a town full of people who couldn't look him in the eye. They told him she'd wasted away, but his gut, honed by years of surviving ambushes and treachery, screamed that something was wrong. So he'd taken his father's knife, his grief, and his suspicion, and he'd vanished into the mountains. He wasn't just hiding, he was waiting for the truth to crawl out of the dark. For 3 nights straight, he'd had the same dream. Margaret standing in his doorway, telling him, "She's coming, Silas." She holds the key. The dream rattled him more than any winter storm. He was a man who dealt in the hard reality of stone and steel, not whispers from the grave. He slammed his coffee cup down. He had wood to chop, traps to check. He had a war to prepare for, even if he was the only one who knew it was coming. 30 miles down the mountain, Eleanor Whitmore was a prisoner in a town square. At 26, she was trapped in a crude wooden wheelchair, surrounded by whispers that stung worse than the winter wind. She had the kind of sharp, intelligent beauty that made people uncomfortable, a constant reminder of the world of books and ballrooms she'd lost. 3 years ago, a stagecoach accident had stolen her parents and the use of her legs. It had also delivered her into the clutches of a distant cousin who was systematically stealing her inheritance while pretending to be her protector. Now, stranded in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, her money almost gone, she was seen as nothing but a burden. The town treated her with a cloying pity that felt like being smothered. They spoke to her like a child, their eyes always skittering away from the useless legs beneath her dress. They had no idea she was fluent in 3 languages, a master of mathematics who could calculate profit margins and investment fraud in her head. They saw a broken girl. They had no idea she'd spent the last year secretly piecing together a crime. She'd overheard enough hushed conversations in the general store, seen enough doctored ledgers to know that Jeremiah Polk, the town's wealthiest merchant, was a thief, and she was sure Polk had something to do with her dwindling trust fund. That was why, when she'd overheard Polk hatch his cruel plan, a strange, cold calm had settled over her. Been alone up there so long, Polk had chuckled to his cronies. Grizzly's probably forgotten what a woman looks like. Bet he'd take anything, even a broken one. They'd laughed. They thought it was the perfect joke, a way to have some fun and get rid of the inconvenient cripple who asked too many smart questions. Eleanor knew she should have been horrified, but a desperate, brilliant plan formed in her mind. Polk wanted her gone. The mountain was the one place he couldn't reach her. If this grisly McGrow was as wild as they claimed, maybe, just maybe, he was the one man in the territory who wasn't under Jeremiah Polk's thumb. It was a wild gamble, a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. So when Saturday came, she let Mrs. Henderson braid her hair and put on her best blue silk dress. She was playing her part in their charade. But as they wheeled her into the town square, her hand was clenched around a small, leather-bound journal hidden in the folds of her skirt. It was filled with numbers, dates, and transactions. The proof that could destroy Jeremiah Polk. The joke was on them. They thought they were throwing her to a beast. In reality, she was walking into the lion's den to find the one man who could help her burn it all down. The town square was buzzing like a hornet's nest. Eleanor sat near the general store, the stage for her public humiliation, feeling the electric charge in the air. She watched them gather, their faces a mix of cruel excitement and feigned piety. She clutched the small journal in her lap. It was her only weapon, her only hope. Then a whisper went through the crowd. "There he is." Silas McGrow appeared at the edge of town, leading a pack mule. He was even more imposing than the story suggested, tall, wide-shouldered, moving with the quiet lethality of a predator. His beard was shot through with silver, his eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. Eleanor had expected a brute, but the man she saw moved with a discipline that spoke of something other than wildness. This was not a man who had simply let himself go. This was a man who had rebuilt himself into something harder, something more dangerous. Jeremiah Polk stepped forward, his belly jiggling with self-importance. "Mr. McGrow!" he boomed, playing to the crowd. "The town has a proposition for you." Silas's gaze swept over the assembled faces, and for a split second, his eyes met Eleanor's. There was no pity in them, no disgust, just a flash of sharp, unnerving recognition, as if he were looking right through her, past the chair, past the broken body, and into the calculating mind within. "We were thinking," Polk continued, gesturing grandly towards Eleanor, "that a man like you might appreciate some companionship. We've found someone special, someone who won't mind the quiet life." Every eye in the square turned to her. This was it, the punchline. She lifted her chin, meeting their stares, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear. Silas's gaze followed Polk's gesture. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. She saw him take in the wheelchair, the fine silk dress so out of place in this dusty town, and then his eyes locked on hers again. A silent question passed between them. It wasn't about her legs. It was about the fight she was hiding. He started walking towards her. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Polk was grinning, sure of his victory. This was the moment the beast would recoil in horror, and the joke would be complete. But Silas McGrow didn't recoil. He stopped in front of her chair and touched the brim of his hat. A gesture of old-fashioned respect that was a slap in the face to every person watching. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the murmuring crowd. "I'm Silas McGrow." She'd been prepared for anything but this. Simple, direct courtesy. "Eleanor Whitmore," she managed, her voice surprisingly steady. "Miss Whitmore," he said. And then he asked the question that changed everything. "Do you want to be here?" It wasn't the question they expected. It wasn't about her disability or his loneliness. It was a question of choice, of will. He was asking if she was a victim or a player in this dangerous game. He was giving her an out, but he was also offering her an alliance. Eleanor looked past him, at Jeremiah Polk's smug face, at the greedy eyes of the men around him. She thought of the journal in her lap. She thought of the justice she craved. She looked back at the mountain man, this stranger who had somehow seen the truth of her in a single glance. "I don't know where I want to be, Mr. McGrow," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I know I don't want to be here." A slow smile touched Silas's lips, transforming his harsh features. It was the smile of a man who had just found a fellow soldier on a battlefield. "Then the choice is yours," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole town to hear. "My cabin's got room for two. If you're inclined to see what the mountains have to offer..." The crowd was stunned into silence. This wasn't the script. Polk's face turned a shade of purple. "Now see here, McGraw," he sputtered. Silas turned to face him, and the quiet mountain man was gone. In his place stood a warrior, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. "I believe the lady made her choice," Silas said. Then he turned back to Eleanor. Without a word, he bent down, and with a strength that seemed impossible, he lifted her from the wheelchair as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her to the sturdy wagon the blacksmith offered, settling her on the bench seat. The town watched, their cruel joke turning to ash in their mouths. Jeremiah Polk stood frozen, watching his pawn get carried off the board. He didn't see the small, triumphant smile on Eleanor's face as the wagon rolled out of town. The joke wasn't over. It had just begun, and Jeremiah Polk was about to become the punchline. The wagon climbed, leaving the stench of Cedar Ridge behind. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was tactical. Two strangers, now allies, sizing each other up. The air grew sharp and clean, smelling of pine and cold stone. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, breaking the quiet. "The mountains make you work for their secrets," Silas replied, his eyes on the trail. He didn't look at her, but she knew he wasn't just talking about the view. He pulled the wagon to a halt by a rushing creek and offered her a cup of water so cold it felt alive. As she drank, she watched him. His hands were never still, but they were never wasted. He moved like a man who knew that a single mistake in this place could be your last. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice direct. "Back there. You could have walked away." He was quiet for a long time, the creek and the wind the only sounds. "Because I recognized the look in your eyes," he said finally. "It was the same look I see in a cornered wolf. You weren't scared. You were getting ready to fight." He paused, then added, "And I don't like bullies." The cabin appeared suddenly, a fortress of timber and stone that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. It was built for defense, not comfort. A single window faced the trail, a perfect firing position. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life in a world of death. As he lifted her down from the wagon, she felt the raw power in his arms, controlled and precise. 15 years, he said, answering her unspoken question. "Built it myself." The inside was stark, clean, and ruthlessly organized. A stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and books. Shelves packed with books on engineering, botany, philosophy, and military strategy. This was no simple hermit. This was a scholar, a soldier, a survivor. He settled her in a chair by the fire, his movements efficient, but she noticed the subtle way he was already adapting the space for her, moving a lamp within her reach, clearing a path for her chair. That evening, over a simple meal of venison stew, the reality of her gamble set in. She was utterly dependent on this dangerous, enigmatic man. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt a flicker of something she thought was dead. Hope. "Polk will be furious," she said. "Let him be," Silas replied, carving a piece of wood with his father's knife. The blade moved with hypnotic grace. "His anger can't reach us up here." He was wrong. Polk's anger could reach anywhere. But for now, this felt like a sanctuary. "What are you making?" she asked. "A new handle for an axe," he said without looking up, "and a brace for this chair. The town blacksmith did shoddy work. It's not balanced right, not safe." He'd noticed in a single glance a structural flaw in her wheelchair that she'd lived with for years. He saw the details. He saw everything. "I should warn you," she said, testing him. "I'm not much use. I can't tend a garden or cook without help." Silas finally looked up, his gray eyes pinning her. "I don't need a cook," he said. "I need a strategist. I saw the journal in your lap, Miss Whitmore. You weren't just sitting there. You were gathering intelligence." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't just seen her. He'd understood her. He knew she wasn't a victim. She was a spy. That night, he gave her the bed and took a bedroll by the fire. Lying in the dark, listening to the howl of the wind, Eleanor clutched her journal. The first part of her plan had worked. She had found a fortress and a guardian. But looking at the man sleeping by the fire, his hand resting near the hilt of his father's knife, she realized he wasn't just a guardian, he was a weapon. and she had no idea if she would be able to control him once she pointed him at her enemy. The next morning, she knew she was right. He woke before dawn, moving with a silent efficiency that was almost unnerving. When he came back inside, he laid a map on the table. It was a hand-drawn map of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding territory, detailed with annotations she couldn't read. "Your turn," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Tell me everything you know about Jeremiah Polk." And so she did. She opened her journal and laid out the web of deceit she had uncovered. The inflated shipping costs, the ghost employees on the mining payrolls, the way he bought up land from failing ranchers for pennies on the dollar after unfortunate accidents. As she spoke, Silas listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When she was done, he simply nodded. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "What do you mean?" "Polk isn't the mastermind," Silas said, his finger tracing a line on the map that led from Cedar Ridge to a powerful mining consortium in Denver. "He's a pawn, a well-paid one, but a pawn nonetheless. He's been helping them acquire land deeds by any means necessary." Then he looked at her, his eyes dark with a history she couldn't begin to fathom. "It's how my father died. He wouldn't sell his claim. So they arranged an accident as in his mind." Suddenly, the board was bigger, the game more deadly. This wasn't just about her inheritance or Polk's petty corruption. This was about a conspiracy that had already claimed lives. "And Margaret?" she whispered, daring to ask. Silas's jaw tightened. "Her family owned the land adjacent to my father's. After my father's death, they were pressured to sell. They refused. A month later, Margaret came down with a sudden, aggressive consumption that no one could explain. Her father sold the land to Polk a week after she was buried. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. They hadn't just been brought together by a cruel joke. They had been brought together by the ghosts of the people they loved, murdered by the same conspiracy. Silas stood up and walked to the fireplace. He reached into a hidden recess in the stone and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. It was his father's. "Polk thinks he's getting rid of you," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "He has no idea he just delivered the one person who can help me decipher this." He opened the ledger. It was filled with his father's handwriting, but it wasn't just mining records. It was code, a complex cipher of numbers and symbols that Silas, for 15 years, had been unable to break. Eleanor looked from the coded ledger to her own journal filled with Polk's finances. He was a soldier. She was a mathematician. He had the what, she had the how. The cruel prank had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. It had united the two people with the means and the motive to bring the whole rotten enterprise crashing down. Their shared sanctuary wasn't just a place to hide. It had just become a war room. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, the rhythm of a coming war. By day, Silas fortified the cabin, checking sightlines, setting deadfall traps on the lesser-known trails, and stockpiling ammunition. He moved with the grim purpose of a soldier preparing for a siege. Eleanor, meanwhile, became a codebreaker. She pored over the two ledgers, her journal of Polk's fraud and the cryptic cipher left by Silas's father. At first, the symbols were meaningless, but then she started seeing it, a pattern, a link between the fraudulent shipping manifests in her book and the repeating numerical sequences in his. "He wasn't just writing in code," she said one evening, her voice electric with discovery. "He was using Polk's own criminal records as the key. Each fraudulent transaction corresponds to a character." It was diabolically brilliant. Silas's father had used his enemy's crimes to create an unbreakable code. And now, with both books in hand, they had the key to unlock it. The work was slow, painstaking. Each decoded phrase was a victory. They learned his father had uncovered a massive gold vein, far richer than anyone knew, running directly under his land and the Hartwell property. The mining consortium in Denver wanted it, and they were willing to kill for it. The names of the consortium partners began to emerge from the cipher. Powerful men, politicians, bankers, men who would never allow a hermit and a cripple to stand in their way. As they worked, the space between them shrank. They were no longer just allies. They were partners, their minds working in sync. He would tell her stories of the war, of tactics and survival, and she would see the mathematical principles behind them. She would explain complex financial schemes, and he would see the human greed and weakness driving them. One evening, as a storm raged outside, he saw her shivering despite the roaring fire. Without a word, he retrieved a heavy bearskin from a chest and draped it over her shoulders. His hands lingered for a moment, his touch gentle, careful. A current passed between them, silent and powerful. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. "You have a fine mind," he told her as she deciphered a particularly complex passage. "The finest weapon in this cabin." It was the first time in years anyone had seen her mind before her chair. The praise warmed her more than any fire. But the ledger held more than just business dealings. It held secrets. One night, a name emerged from the cipher that made Silas freeze. Dr. Alistair Finch. "I know that name," Silas said, his voice tight. "He was the doctor who signed Margaret's death certificate. He always said there was nothing he could do." But the ledger told a different story. Dr. Finch had received a substantial payment from Polk's accounts just 2 days after Margaret died. A payment disguised as a land purchase. It wasn't consumption, it was poison. The grief that hit Silas was a physical thing, a storm that had been gathering for 15 years. He went outside into the driving snow, and Eleanor heard a sound that chilled her to the bone, a roar of pure, unadulterated rage that echoed off the peaks, a man's soul breaking. When he came back inside, the wild grief was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying, a cold, diamond-hard certainty. The soldier who had been dormant for 15 years was now fully awake. "They're not just going to prison," he said, his voice quiet, deadly. "They're going to pay." Eleanor looked at the man before her, his face a mask of cold fury, and a sliver of fear pierced her resolve. She had wanted a weapon, and she had gotten one. But she was starting to wonder if his quest for vengeance would consume them both before they ever had a chance at justice. The very next day, the mountain sent them a warning. A lone wolf, massive and gray with intelligent yellow eyes, appeared at the edge of the clearing. It didn't act like a normal wolf. It watched the cabin, patient, sentinel. "That's not right," Silas said, his hand going to his rifle. "Wolves don't do that. Not unless something has pushed them out of their territory, something they fear more than man." The wolf was a sign, an omen. Their time in the sanctuary was over. The enemy was on the move, and they were coming. The cipher had given them the truth, but it had also armed their enemies with a motive for murder. If anyone discovered that Silas had his father's ledger, he and Eleanor would be silenced, permanently. That night, as Silas kept watch by the window, rifle in hand, Eleanor made a discovery that changed the stakes completely. Tucked into a hidden pocket in the back of the ledger was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It wasn't in code. It was a deed, a legally binding deed, signed and notarized, granting ownership of Silas's father's land and the Hartwell property to a single heir. Any child born of the union between Silas McGrow and Margaret Hartwell. And tucked in with it was a small, faded locket. Margaret's locket. Inside there wasn't a picture. There was a tiny, intricately folded note. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. The note was from Margaret, written in the last days of her life. "My dearest Silas, Finch has told me the truth. It is the consortium. They will not stop. I fear for our child. I have sent him away, with my sister, to Boston. I pray he will be safe. His name is Samuel. Find our boy, Silas. Avenge us. A child." Silas had a son he never knew existed. He was not the last of his line. He had a legacy to protect. Margaret hadn't just been murdered. She had died protecting their son. Eleanor looked up at Silas, who was still staring out into the unforgiving darkness. A man who thought he had lost everything. She held in her hands the proof that he had everything to fight for. But how could she tell him? How could she hand him a hope that would also be the most profound pain he had ever known? Before she could speak, a sound cut through the night. The sharp crack of a rifle. The shot didn't come from the woods. It came from the direction of the trail leading back to Cedar Ridge. Someone was coming up the mountain, and they weren't coming to talk. The rifle shot echoed, a stark declaration of war. Silas didn't hesitate. He doused the lamps, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness. "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice the clipped bark of a sergeant. He moved through the shadows with a grace that defied his size, a ghost in his own home. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She tucked the locket and the note deep into a hidden pocket of her dress, the secret of burning weight against her skin. Now was not the time. First, survival. Another shot rang out, closer this time, and the single pane of glass in the main window shattered. "They're trying to draw us out," Silas whispered, pressing himself against the wall. "Amateurs. They think we'll panic." Through the broken window, Eleanor could see the flicker of torches in the trees. More than one man. At least 3, maybe 4. They were trying to surround the cabin, but Silas had prepared for this. He had spent 15 years learning every rock, every tree, every shadow on this mountain. This wasn't their territory. It was his. "The floorboards," he said, his voice barely a breath. "By the hearth, lift the bearskin." Eleanor maneuvered her chair in the darkness, her hands finding the thick fur rug. Beneath it was a trap door she had never seen. It led not to a cellar, but to a narrow tunnel carved out of the rock foundation of the cabin. An escape route, a bolt hole. "Go," he ordered. "Follow it to the end. It comes out in the rock slide behind the cabin. Wait for me there. Do not make a sound." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered fiercely. His hand found hers in the dark, his grip firm, unyielding. "This isn't a debate, Eleanor. You have the proof. You are the mission. Now go." He pressed the cold steel of a small pistol into her hand. "You know how to use this. One shot. Don't hesitate." Before she could argue, he was gone, melting back into the shadows near the front door. With no other choice, Eleanor opened the trapdoor and began the agonizing process of lowering herself into the tunnel. It was a tight fit, the rough-hewn stone scraping at her clothes, but she moved with a desperate urgency. Above her, she heard the splintering crash of the cabin door being kicked in. Then, gunfire. A deafening roar in the confined space. 2 shots from Silas's rifle, followed by a scream of pain. Then silence. A terrible, bottomless silence. She had to keep moving. She pulled herself through the tunnel, her arms burning, her mind screaming. The tunnel was longer than she expected, twisting in the dark. It smelled of damp earth and cold stone. Finally, her hands felt a different texture. Not rock, but wood. A wooden barrier. She pushed and it swung open with a groan. She was outside, hidden in a jumble of massive boulders 100 yards behind the cabin. The air was frigid, the wind whipping snow into her face. From her hiding place, she could see the cabin, torches casting wild dancing shadows. She saw 2 figures drag a body out into the snow, one of Polk's men. But where was Silas? Then she saw movement near the side of the cabin, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Silas. He was circling around them, using the darkness he knew so well. He was hunting them, one by one. A second gunman, overconfident, stepped away from the cover of the cabin, holding his torch high to get a better look. It was the last mistake he'd ever make. A flash from the trees, the crack of Silas's rifle, and the man crumpled into the snow, his torch hissing as it died. The remaining men panicked. They started firing wildly into the darkness, shouting, their fear a palpable thing. "McGrow, show yourself!" one of them yelled. Silas answered with another shot, this one taking out a torch, plunging them into deeper darkness. He was toying with them, dismantling them. Eleanor watched, her terror mixed with a grim awe. This was the man the war had made, a relentless, efficient killer. But then a voice cut through the chaos, a voice she recognized with a jolt of pure hatred. Jeremiah Polk. "Burn it!" Polk shrieked, his voice thin with panic. "Burn the whole damn thing to the ground. He can't have that ledger." A torch arced through the air, landing on the dry timber of the cabin roof. The flames caught instantly, greedily, licking up the side of the cabin, painting the snow-covered clearing in a hellish orange light. The fire exposed everything. There was nowhere left for Silas to hide. He was trapped between the burning cabin and the remaining gunmen. Eleanor's heart seized. The ledger, his father's life's work, her evidence, all of it was turning to ash. But worse, Silas was now a perfect target, silhouetted against the flames. She saw him break from cover, running not away from the fight, but towards it. He was a dervish of motion, a blur of controlled violence. He closed the distance with the nearest gunman in a heartbeat, his father's knife flashing in the firelight. The man went down without a sound. But the last man, the one standing next to Polk, raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow down. Eleanor saw the muzzle flash, heard the sickening thud of the bullet hitting flesh. She saw Silas stagger, his hand flying to his side. He was hit. He stumbled but didn't fall, his momentum carrying him forward. He drove his shoulder into Polk, sending the portly man sprawling into the snow. But the last gunman was leveling his pistol for a final, killing shot. Eleanor didn't think. She acted. She raised the small pistol Silas had given her, the cold metal shaking in her hands. She remembered his words. One shot. Don't hesitate. She steadied her hands, aimed for the dark shape of the gunman, and squeezed the trigger. The pistol kicked, the sound shockingly loud. The gunman cried out, clutching his arm, his own pistol falling into the snow. It was over. The clearing was silent, save for the roar of the fire. Polk was on the ground, whimpering. Silas was standing over him, swaying on his feet, his shirt stained a dark, terrifying red. The cabin, their sanctuary, their war room, was an inferno. The ledger was gone, but they were alive. As Silas tied up a blubbering Jeremiah Polk and the wounded gunman, Eleanor pulled herself through the snow towards him. His wound was bad, a deep gash in his side, bleeding freely. It's nothing, he grunted, his face pale in the firelight. It was a lie. They both knew it. He was losing too much blood. The fire was dying down, leaving only the smoking skeleton of the cabin. Everything they had fought for, the proof, was gone. Despair, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. It's over, she whispered, the words tasting like defeat. They've won. Silas sank to his knees beside her, his strength finally giving out. He looked at the ruins of his home, the culmination of 15 years of waiting. No, he rasped, his voice weak but threaded with steel. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. His hand came out holding a small oilskin-wrapped package. It was scorched around the edges, but intact. He pushed it into her hands. He didn't use just one ledger, Silas whispered, a faint, triumphant smile on his lips. My father never put all his eggs in one basket. That's a copy, the real proof. She stared at the package in her hands, then at the man bleeding in the snow beside her. They had lost their fortress. He was badly wounded, but they had the truth. And now they had their prisoners. The mountain had tested them with fire and blood, and they had survived. But as she looked at Silas's pale face, a new fear took hold. Surviving the fight was one thing. Surviving the aftermath was another. And with the nearest doctor miles away, a man who had likely murdered his first love, Silas's time was running out. Dawn broke over a scene of devastation. The cabin was a charred skeleton, a ghost of what it had been. Silas was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his face ashen. Eleanor had done what she could for his wound, packing it with clean cloth torn from her dress. But it wasn't enough. He was dying, and they were trapped. Polk and his wounded gunmen were tied securely to a tree, shivering and sullen. But they were the least of her problems. A blizzard was rolling in, the sky a bruised, angry purple. The temperature was dropping fast. If they stayed here, Silas would die from the wound, or they would both freeze to death. The only option was the one that seemed impossible. She had to get him down the mountain, to Cedar Ridge, back into the Viper's nest. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only mission she had. She managed to get Silas onto the back of the pack mule, lashing him into place. Every movement, every jostle, sent a fresh wave of agony across his face. She loaded the wounded gunman onto another horse. He was her bargaining chip, her proof of the attack. Polk, she forced to walk, tied to the lead rope like the animal he was. Then she began the descent. It was a nightmare. The trail was steep, slick with ice, and the first flakes of the blizzard were already beginning to fall. She was navigating from memory, her wheelchair useless in this terrain. She was crawling, dragging herself through the snow, pulling the lead rope of the mule that carried Silas. Her hands were raw, her muscles screaming, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every time she felt her resolve waver, she looked back at Silas's still form, and she thought of the secret she carried. A son. His son. Find our boy, Silas. Avenge us. She wasn't just saving him, she was saving a father for his son. Hours blurred into an agony of cold and effort. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, a blinding white curtain. Polk, stumbling ahead of her, began to mock her, his voice a venomous sneer. "You're not going to make it," he spat. "He's going to die up here, and then they'll find you, frozen solid. A pathetic end for a pathetic cripple." His words were meant to break her, but they did the opposite. They fueled a fire of pure, cold rage inside her. She remembered Silas's words from their first meeting. "I recognize the look in your eyes." A cornered wolf. She was cornered, and she was done being the prey. She saw it then, a narrow ravine, a shortcut she remembered Silas pointing out on a map. It was dangerous, almost impassable, but it would cut hours off their journey. "We're going this way," she said, her voice raw. "That's suicide," Polk protested. "The trail is treacherous." "Then you'd better watch your step," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any warmth. The ravine was a trial by ice, a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for the mule, with a sheer drop on one side. The wind howled, trying to tear them from the mountainside. More than once the mule slipped, its hooves skittering on the ice, and Eleanor's heart stopped. But they held. She held. She was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, the Chicago socialite. She was a force of nature, driven by love and a promise to a ghost. As they emerged from the ravine, bruised and battered but alive, they saw it, the faint lights of Cedar Ridge, twinkling through the blizzard. They had made it. As they stumbled into the town's main street, a few early risers stared in disbelief. The sight was surreal. The broken girl, now a warrior covered in snow and grim determination, leading a procession of the damned. The town's most powerful man, humbled and bound. A wounded gunman slung over a horse, and the mountain man a legend, strapped to a mule, looking like a fallen god. Eleanor didn't stop. She marched them straight to the only place that mattered, the doctor's office, Dr. Finch's office. The door opened, and the doctor, a small man with shifty eyes, stared at the scene, his face draining of all color. "There's been an attack," Eleanor announced, her voice ringing with an authority no one in this town had ever heard from her. "Mr. McGraw is shot. You will save him." Finch hesitated, his eyes darting to Jeremiah Polk, a silent, panicked conversation passing between them. He opened his mouth to refuse, to lie, to say it was impossible. But before he could speak, Eleanor pulled a small pistol from her dress. She didn't point it at him. She simply laid it on the examination table between them. "I said," she repeated, her voice as cold as the ice on the mountain, "you will save him, or the next patient you see will be yourself." The doctor, faced with a choice between a distant, powerful conspiracy and the immediate, deadly certainty of the woman in front of him, made his decision. He nodded, his hands trembling. "Bring him in," he stammered. While Finch worked, Eleanor didn't rest. She sent for the town's blacksmith, the one man who had shown Silas kindness. She handed him the oilskin packet. "Take this," she ordered. "Ride for Leadville. Don't stop for anything. Get this to a territorial marshal named Henley. Tell him Silas McGraw sent you." The blacksmith looked at the packet, then at the iron will in her eyes, and nodded. He knew a battlefield commission when he saw one. He was gone within minutes, a lone rider charging into the blizzard, carrying the truth that could bring down an empire. Now all she could do was wait. Wait and see if the man she loved would live, and pray that the man trying to save him wasn't the same man who had murdered his first love. The room was a cage of tension. Finch worked frantically, his hands slick with Silas's blood, his face beaded with sweat. Eleanor watched his every move, her gaze a physical weight in the room, ensuring he did his duty. Polk and his man were locked in the town's small jail, but Eleanor knew that was a temporary solution. The real power in this territory wasn't held in a jail cell. It was held by the men whose names were in that ledger. And they would be coming. The bullet was out. Finch had stitched the wound, but Silas was still lost in a fevered unconsciousness. He was alive, but barely. His life hung by a thread, and that thread was in the hands of his lover's potential murderer. It was then that Eleanor made another gamble, a psychological one. She looked at Dr. Finch, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "She knew, you know," Eleanor said quietly. The doctor looked up, confused. "Who?" "Margaret Hartwell," Eleanor said, her eyes boring into his. "She knew it was you. She knew you poisoned her on Polk's orders." Finch's composure shattered. He dropped a bloody instrument with a clatter. "That's a lie. It was consumption. It's on the death certificate." "Certificates can be bought, just like doctors," Eleanor said, her voice relentless. "But she left proof, doctor. A letter. Naming you. Naming everyone involved. A letter I made sure was sent to the authorities before I ever came down this mountain. It was a complete bluff. A fabrication born of desperation. But Finch didn't know that. All he saw was the end of his world. He collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. "They made me do it," he sobbed. "Polk, the consortium. They said they'd ruin me. They said they'd harm my family." The confession was a bitter victory. It was the truth Silas had sought for 15 years. But it didn't change the fact that he was still dying. As the blizzard raged outside, trapping them in this town of enemies, Eleanor realized the fight on the mountain was just the first battle. The war was here, in this room, and her only allies were a blacksmith riding for help that might never arrive, and the terrified, guilt-ridden man who held Silas's life in his hands. The waiting was a special kind of hell. Hours crawled by. Silas's fever raged. He thrashed in his delirium, muttering a name over and over. Margaret. Dr. Finch, now a broken man, did everything he could, desperate to save the life of the man whose love he had destroyed, perhaps hoping it would somehow save his own soul. Eleanor sat by Silas's bedside, holding his hand, speaking to him in low tones, trying to pull him back from the brink. She told him about the ledger, about the blacksmith, about his son. She poured the secret into his unconscious ear, hoping it would be an anchor, something to tether him to the world of the living. "You have a son, Silas," she whispered, her tears falling onto his hand. "His name is Samuel. You have to live. You have to meet your boy." Outside, the town was a powder keg. News of Polk's arrest had spread. Some were shocked. Others, those who had been squeezed and threatened by Polk for years, were emboldened. Factions were forming. The town was turning on itself. But Eleanor knew Polk's allies, the ones with real power, would not stand idly by. They would send men, not clumsy thugs like the ones on the mountain, but professionals, killers. She needed a contingency plan. She sent a message to the young blacksmith's wife, a woman she had seen openly defy Polk in the past. She told her to gather the women of the town, the ones who had lost husbands in mining accidents, the ones who had lost their farms to Polk's predatory loans. She told them to be ready. The second day dawned and the blizzard broke. The world was silent, buried under a thick blanket of white. And with the clear weather came the sound Eleanor had been dreading, the sound of riders. A dozen of them, maybe more, picking their way into town. They weren't lawmen. They were hard-faced men with rifles across their saddles, moving with the cold efficiency of a death squad. They were the consortium's men, sent to clean up Polk's mess, sent to silence everyone. They surrounded the doctor's office. Their leader, a man with a dead-eyed stare and a long scar down his cheek, dismounted. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open. "We're here for the prisoners," he said, his voice flat and cold. "And the woman." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. Her pistol was on her lap, hidden beneath a blanket. "You're too late," she said. "The evidence is already on its way to the federal marshals." The man whose name she later learned was Corrigan simply smiled, a chilling, empty smile. "Evidence can be lost," he said, "along with the people who carry it." He took a step into the room, and then something happened that he did not expect. The front door of the doctor's office was blocked, not by men with guns, but by women. The blacksmith's wife stood at the front, holding a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. Beside her was the preacher's wife with a rolling pin. Behind them were a dozen more. The widows, the dispossessed, the women of Cedar Ridge, armed with kitchen utensils and a fury that had been simmering for years. "You'll have to go through us," the blacksmith's wife said, her voice shaking but firm. Corrigan laughed. "This is cute, ladies, but we don't have time for games." He raised his pistol, and from the bed, a voice, weak but clear as a bell, spoke. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Silas. He was awake. He was holding Eleanor's pistol in a surprisingly steady hand, aiming it directly at Corrigan's chest. His eyes were clear, the fever broken. The soldier was back. "You and your men are going to get back on your horses," Silas said, his voice raspy but full of command. "And you're going to ride out of this town." Corrigan was caught, a professional killer trapped between a wall of angry women and a wounded mountain man who looked like he had nothing left to lose. He hesitated, his mind calculating the odds. And in that moment of hesitation, a new sound reached them. A bugle call, clear and sharp in the cold mountain air. Riders were coming, a lot of them. But these weren't thugs. They were soldiers, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the white snow. At their head was Marshal Henley, and beside him, the blacksmith, looking exhausted but triumphant. Corrigan's face went slack. He was trapped, outmaneuvered, outgunned by a woman in a wheelchair, a wounded soldier, and a small army of housewives. It wasn't a battle. It was a rout. The consortium's men surrendered without a single shot fired. The conspiracy was broken, as Marshal Henley placed Jeremiah Polk, Dr. Finch, and Corrigan's entire death squad in irons. A strange quiet fell over Cedar Ridge. The town had been poisoned by secrets and fear for years. Now, the poison was being drawn out. Silas, weak but resolute, finally looked at Eleanor. He didn't speak of the fight, or the conspiracy, or the years of pain. He asked only one question. "Is it true?" he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "Do I have a son?" "Yes, Silas," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she placed Margaret's locket in his hand. "His name is Samuel, and he's waiting for his father." The war for the mountain was over. The battle for justice had been won. But for Silas McGraw, a new journey was just beginning, a journey to find the son he never knew he had. And he would not be making that journey alone. The woman who had been sent to him as a joke, the woman who had fought armies of thugs and conspiracies to save him, would be by his side. They had started as strangers, united by vengeance. They had become partners, forged in fire. And now, as they looked towards a future neither of them could have ever imagined, they knew they were something more. They were a family. The months that followed were a whirlwind of healing and justice. The full weight of the territorial and federal governments came down on the Denver Mining Consortium. The trials were swift, the evidence undeniable. Powerful men were ruined, their empire of greed dismantled piece by piece. Eleanor's testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution. She delivered it with a cold, precise clarity that left no room for doubt. The woman they had dismissed as a broken, incompetent cripple became the architect of their downfall. Silas, meanwhile, recovered his strength, the mountain air and Eleanor's constant care, a better medicine than any doctor could provide. He was a different man. The haunted, solitary hermit was gone, replaced by a man with a purpose, a future. A quiet, powerful joy had taken root in him. Together they made plans. They sent letters to Margaret's sister in Boston, who confirmed everything. Samuel was alive, a young man of 15, raised to believe his parents had died in an accident. A reunion was planned. With Eleanor's restored inheritance and the restitution ordered by the courts, they were wealthy. They could have gone anywhere, lived any life they chose. But the mountain was their home. They rebuilt the cabin, not as a fortress, but as a home. Larger, with more windows to let in the light, and a ramp that allowed Eleanor to move freely from the porch out into the clearing. They were married in the spring in a simple ceremony on the mountainside, with Marshal Henley and the blacksmith's family as their witnesses. It wasn't the end of a story, it was the beginning. That summer, a train arrived in Denver carrying a boy with his mother's eyes and his father's quiet strength. The meeting between Silas and Samuel was a moment of profound, unspoken emotion, a lifetime of loss and longing bridged in a single, tearful embrace. They spent the rest of the summer on the mountain, a family forged from tragedy and resilience. Silas taught his son about the mountains, about his father, about the legacy of honor and strength that was his birthright. Eleanor taught him about books and numbers, but more than that, she taught him about the kind of courage that doesn't require a weapon. Cedar Ridge was transformed. With Polk's corrupt influence gone, the town began to heal. The people who had once mocked Eleanor now looked at her with a mixture of awe and shame. They saw her not as the crippled girl, but as the woman who had faced down murderers and saved their town from itself. The story of the cruel joke became a local legend, a cautionary tale about underestimating the power of those the world deems broken. They never understood the full truth, the layers of conspiracy and murder. They just knew that their prank had somehow, miraculously, led to their salvation. One evening, as the sun set, painting the peaks in fiery colors, Silas and Eleanor sat on their porch, watching Samuel skip stones across the creek. The sound of his laughter echoed in the valley. "Do you ever think about it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "How it all started? A joke, an act of pure cruelty." Silas took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. "I think," he said, his voice filled with a deep, unwavering peace, "that sometimes the devil overplays his hand. He meant it for evil, but it was turned to good." He looked at her, his love for her shining in his eyes, a love that had been tested by fire and found to be unbreakable. "They sent me a broken woman," he said, "and she made my whole world new." The cruelest moments can lead to the greatest blessings. What the world sees as broken, the heart can see as perfect. A town's mockery became a legend. A quest for vengeance became a journey to family. And a love story, born in the heart of a dark conspiracy, proved that the strongest fortresses aren't made of stone and timber, but of courage, truth, and two hearts beating as one. If you enjoyed this story, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the stories we have coming your way are only going to get wilder. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was it justice or was it fate? Until next time, stay safe out there.